Hello everyone. I would like to start by thanking John Foran for the organization of the panel and also all its participants. I'm very glad to be part of the session even if I was not able to come in Toronto. Thank you very much. My name is Laurence Marty and I'm doing a PhD in anthropology that I have started during the COP21, just before the COP21 actually, the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, which took place in Paris. My research focuses on climate change movements building in Europe. And I will talk as a researcher, but also as an activist of these movements. If my paper could appear as critic, just keep in mind that it comes from the inside. I'm talking about dynamics I'm part of. This paper will focus on one structural issue in the building process of climate justice movements in Europe and in Maghreb that I had the opportunity to observe. The discrepancies between the global climate justice framework and the way most local and grassroots struggles think and organize themselves. In order to discuss this point, I will first give a rapid reminder of what climate justice means to connect with the building process of movements. Climate justice is about a double injustice. People who are the least responsible about climate change suffer most of its consequences. Moreover, climate change reinforces gender, racial, and economic inequalities and reveal how these struggles are interconnected as a system. As a consequence, the climate justice movement considers that people most affected by this crisis must be the leader of this movement. They need to speak for themselves. This is the meaning of the slogan, Frontline of Crisis, Forefront of Change, which was chosen by the Movement for the People's Walk in New York City in September 2014 and embodied during that walk by having the demonstration led by these frontline communities and their brothers. These points lead us to the key tension of climate justice movement I would like to talk about here. We are all affected by climate change, but not in the same way. The question is, consequently, who is the legitimate political subject of climate justice movements? This previous way to formulate the question is directly linked to Marxist inheritance and question about historical subject of class struggle. While it may not be framed this way, this question appears in the climate justice collectives I followed. For instance, who are the impacted communities in Europe? Do they understand themselves in this way? How can we let these communities speak for themselves? How not to be an urban, middle-class white movement anymore? How to create alliances with feminist unions, anti-racist struggles, and more broadly, frontline communities, whether they are in Europe or not. We can notice that those questions about historical subjects, while inherited from the Marxist tradition, have been altered and, to a certain point, deepened by feminist movements, especially Afro-feminist one, and the analysis about intersectionality they came with. The political subject is not a single and homogeneous one anymore, but rather a coalition of political subjects liberating together. Now, I would like to tell you stories that provide examples as to how these questions are accurate in the movements. First, I will talk about the collective Toxic Tour Detox 93 and its involvement in preparing mobilization for COP21. Then, I will bring thoughts from two Moroccan activists about risk of neocolonialism embedded in climate justice movements. So first, COP21, Paris. The year before COP21, I participated in and studied a collective named called Toxic Tour Detox 93. The idea of the collective, which brings together inhabitants of Seine-Saint-Denis, the poorest district of Paris region, was to address environmental and climate inequalities by organizing walks around highly polluting or carbon-emitting projects of the district: highways, airports, data centers. Seine-Saint-Denis also happened to host the Paris Climate Summit, which, in fact, took place in a city called Le Bourget, and not in Paris. Toxic Tour Detox 93 was thus directly inspired by the environmental justice movement with a clear message. They are organizing a global climate summit where we live, and nobody will invite us, even though we are the most affected of the area, even though we are the local frontlines community. One of the points which really caught my attention in the dynamic of the collective was, even if all its members were living in the district, we were all the time looking for specific inhabitants. They must be local, living closer to polluting infrastructures, from popular background, but above all, people of color. We were too white, and it was true. This specific kind of inhabitants of the area seemed indispensable by the Toxic Tour collective in order to be considered as genuinely grassroots and thus legitimate. Even though most of these inhabitants were not feeling really concerned about environmental and climate issues and were more directly concerned about their living, working, or health conditions. In a way, it was a bit as if the members of the Toxic Tour collective had a vision of environmental and climate justice movement marked by American mobilization and wanted to reproduce the same, while risking sidelining the fact Paris suburbs are also inhabited by white working class. Thoughts about who were and still are the frontline communities in the French territory were an explicit question in the Climate Coalition organizing mobilization. And this question came up many times during those times, with different kinds of answers, from refugee to women all over the world. But in France, it seems that no community was defining itself as frontline, in the way the North American network Global Grassroots Justice Alliance could, for example. Therefore, a possibility was also to act in solidarity with these communities, located in the Global South for the most part. Let's now move from COP21 to COP22, from Paris to Marrakesh. Last winter, I had the opportunity to meet Noura El-Wardi, a French-Moroccan activist who was in charge of coordinating the COP22 mobilization. I was really interested in meeting her because I heard she was working on a text about the neocolonial tendencies of climate justice movements, especially in Maghreb. This point was resonating with the speech of the Moroccan activist Hamza Amouchen in the World Social Forum of 2016 in Montreal that I have read a few months before, entitled "What Does It Mean to Fight for Climate Justice in Maghreb?" In his speech, Hamza Amouchen starts by describing the extractivist model in Maghreb as a system of pillage, dependence, and neocolonial appropriation. He then enumerates the institutions that shape the ecological and climate discourse in this part of the world, observing that this discourse is mainly driven by international institutions, such as the European Union or the World Bank, working with local institutions. He stresses that, in this process, the ecological and climate discourse is greenwashed from any reference to the historical responsibility of industrialized Western societies or the crimes of oil companies such as Shell or BP. He concludes by describing the climate justice concept as a foreign and unintelligible one without roots in Maghreb and which gives a weird translation in Arabic. His analysis is not different with the environmental justice concept. For him, these concepts bring with them the risk of a fragmented understanding of inequalities. His final remark underlines the importance of contextualizing discourses and concepts, and of looking from where they were shaped. The analysis of Noura El-Wardi was somewhat different in terms of experience and reasoning, but similar in terms of conclusions about the risk of neocolonialism dynamics being embedded in the climate justice concept and movements. She described the mobilization organization during COP22, and stressed the willingness of French organizations, which had coordinated the mobilization during COP21, to share some of the resources they used in order to support the movement in Morocco. She said, "We had a huge pressure from the international in terms of mobilization, with the idea of working as a coalition." Noura El-Wardi described the lack of capacity of the coalition, which had to work with Moroccan institutions, given the political context which limits political space to involve local movements linked with the climate justice movement's concern. The organizational framing of a broad coalition was somewhat, in this case, a disabler of actual climate justice struggles in the region, such as the movements against civil mines in Morocco, phosphate mines in Tunisia and Algeria, or against water waste in the tourism industry in the whole area. Indeed, she stressed that the coalition umbrella mobilization ended up being depoliticized, as it focused on individuals' responsibility about waste littering. She asked, "For who was it so important to organize a mobilization about climate justice in Morocco? What is the quality of the solidarity links you create in such situation?" She pointed to issues of rhythm and schedule. For her, these local and global coalitions are often not really about solidarity, but much more about participating in the most global moments possible. They are less about prioritizing frontline struggles than about staging them for communication's sakes. She has been charged by 350.org and a French altermondialist organization to write a report about environmental struggles in France and make recommendations to deepen the climate justice movement in the country. Her recommendations are about rhythm, words, the necessity to educate and not make pre-assumptions, and to accept to step back and use other frames, to find a window, not to create it, to take her words. Her recommendations are also about allies for the climate justice movement. She points to movements with a long history and relatively wide reach out in the country, such as unions, anti-nuclear movement, and farmer struggles, as being the priority. For her, the climate justice movement should first connect with these movements, instead of prioritizing intersectionality by reaching out to anti-racist movements, such as collective fighting against racist police violence. The work of Malcolm Ferdinand, a French researcher working on ecology from a Caribbean perspective, had the same impact on me. Why the hell are French movements not thinking about the inhabitants of overseas territories when they are looking for European frontline communities? The framing of France as limited to its continental ports is that strong that we cannot decenter ourselves, even when we try to connect with decolonization movements. For me, these thoughts lead to new questions to add to the one listed earlier. As Europeans, from which soils can and should we speak, and from which inheritance is? To address the root causes and future impacts of climate change as a movement implies decolonizing it, and to quote the researcher Mamta Motwani-Akapadi in her article When White Women Cried, How White Women Tears Oppress Women of Color, and I quote, "This process should be rooted in empowerment, not guilt." Thank you for your attention.